In this lecture, we're going to talk about classification architectures. So there are different ways to characterize an architecture. A simple one is to use depth as the number of layers. A very important architecture that a lot of recent work focused on is the number of learnable or trainable network parameters. Also important is the memory consumption during inference and training. Further, the number of computations during inference and training are important. The speed of inference on a particular hardware architecture is also something that people are concerned about. Finally, this is probably the second most used one, together with the number of network parameters, or even the most used one, that is simply the task performance. How well does the architecture do on a particular task? In our context for this lecture, classification, image classification. So the two main metrics that are reported here are top 5 or top 1 ImageNet classification accuracy. As a reminder, top 1 just means you have one guess and this will be compared to ground truth, and top 5 means that you can guess 5 times, and if one of your top 5 guesses is the same as ground truth, it counts as correct. In the beginning, many architectures reported top 5 accuracy because top 1 was too difficult, but in recent years, people switched to reporting top 1 accuracy on ImageNet. So here is one example graph that plots architecture evaluated based on these two metrics. One is ImageNet top 1 accuracy, that is on the up-axis, and then we have number of parameters in millions on the x-axis. One thing to note here is that the up-axis doesn't start at 0 but at 74. So a really widely used network, for example, is ResNet 50, and that is a good baseline to use to judge some of these other more modern networks. Also note that this graph here focuses on efficient networks. What we see here is that the biggest networks have under 100 million parameters. However, networks up to 1 billion parameters were generated and proposed. While it seems in the beginning overwhelming to get to know all these different architectures, it is actually an important part of deep learning to get to know different architectures and study them in some more detail. One reason is that network architectures in one task, such as image classification, are then also often used as a component for other tasks such as object detection or segmentation. Also, the architecture ideas often transcend many different problems, and therefore one can see that the same components are used in many different research areas. But in our discussion, we will go back in time, and we are starting to discuss famous networks that aren't even on this slide yet. And then we would like to work our way up basically to this network, fixed efficient net B7. So one side note, how are we counting the layers in a neural network? The guiding principle is that we would only like to count layers with parameters. But of course, this is inconsistently applied. In general, that means that we are counting fully connected and convolutional layers. Pooling layers may or may not count. Generally, they don't count. Some rare people count them. The input layer itself also does not count because there's no computation going on. The input layer just describes the data. Then nonlinear activation layers do not count. So we're not counting ReLU or 10H or leaky ReLU. Also, if there's something like a parameterized leaky ReLU, the expectation would be that this is generally not counted, even though this layer might have a parameter. Normalization layers also have parameters such as batch norm, dropout has parameters, but these layers also are not counted. Then examples, VGG16 is a network that has 16 layers plus many other layers that do not count. ResNet 50 has 50 layers plus many other layers that don't count. One really nice thing about PyTorch is that several of these fundamental and famous networks can be loaded even in a pre-trained fashion. So to get access to a network for image classification, you basically need one line of code. We will look at some of these examples later. In this lecture, we will encounter networks that have simple and some that have more complex network topology. The simple networks, they have a chain topology. For example, LeNet, AlexNet, and VGG. What that means is that the input will be passed onto a layer L1, and then the output of layer L1 goes to layer L2, the output to layer L3, and then, there can be an arbitrary number of layers, but everything is organized in a chain. That means we don't have any branching in the network. Complex networks use additional components, such as adding tensors together, tensor concatenation, and tensor copying. This is an example of a more complex network where the input would be passed to layer 1, and then there would be some copy operation where the output of layer 1 would be sent over as input to 3 different layers, L2, L3, and L4, and then maybe the output of L2 and L3 would be concatenated together, and then we see at the end here there is an add operation where 2 tensors are added together, and then there's a final output. And what is not shown here, this is still a very simple example, the graphs of such networks, they can go totally crazy. As an example, here's the paper exploring randomly wired neural networks for image recognition. What we can see in this figure is that the topology of these networks can be pretty crazy. Also later on, maybe on this page, we see several more of these random networks that have really complex topology. Let's look at some of these components that are used to create more complicated networks. One is the operation of adding tensors together. What we have are 2 input tensors, x and y, that have exactly the same shape. They need to agree in width and height and the number of channels. The output is a tensor set that also has exactly the same shape as the 2 input tensors x and y. Basically, the whole operation is straightforward. As written as tensors, we would write it like this, and the tensors are added element-wise. That means for each element with index w, h, and z, we take this element with the same index from the tensor x and the one with the same index from tensor y, and we add them together. And this addition is performed for each of the width times height times number of channels, number of elements. This is a straightforward extension from vector and matrix addition. Here we see one possible way how this is drawn by some node that has a plus operation inside, and there would be one or multiple inputs to this, and all the tensors that are input to this plus will be added together. Tensor concatenation has n tensors that agree in the spatial dimensions. So we have the first tensor has width and height, and all the way down to the nth tensor, they have the same width and the same height. However, the number of channels can differ. So each of the tensors, x1 to xn, can have a different number of channels. The output then is a tensor y that has the same spatial resolution with height, but the number of channels is the sum of the number of channels of each of the individual tensors. So it's going to be C1 plus 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 Cn. So the channels are concatenated. Basically, we start with the first tensor x1, and then we append the next tensor x2 to it, and so on and so forth until xn. That means the size of the output tensor, so the output tensor has as many elements of all the input tensors together. So here is one way to draw that, where there would be some concatenation layer, and so generally it's not a layer, but concatenation operation maybe, where there's multiple tensors coming in that are concatenated, and then as output we have the concatenated tensor. The trick is that this is generally not drawn as a separate operation. What you will see more often is you have something like a confor FC layer that simply has multiple inputs going into the layer. And then you kind of have to know or read in the text that what the authors mean by that is that the inputs are all concatenated together before maybe the convolution is performed. And one example of this is TensorNet. Tensor copying has maybe as input one tensor, and then as output multiple copies of the same tensor. Now, again, I draw this operation explicitly, which is not common, where you see the tensor x as input and then multiple copies of the same tensor x as output. What you sometimes see in a network is an unlabeled branch. So you see something like this. There's a tensor x that travels, and then there's just a fork in the path, and that denotes that there will be a copy made of this tensor, and this copy will be sent along the two branches. Also, another drawing style that you will often see is that there's just the output of one layer will be sent as input to multiple other layers. For example, multiple other conv or FC layers. Let's travel way back in time to LeNet 5. There's a web page about this network and also a paper from LeCun et al. gradient-based learning applied to document recognition. Reading this paper might be quite difficult because it doesn't really use the modern methodology, knowing everything that people know now and putting it in the same terminology. The paper might actually be quite short and quite simple. However, this was written a very long time ago, and therefore the terms used and the explanations are quite different from what we are used now. This paper is of tremendous historical importance, and it's a really very early and successful ConvNet that was able to perform tasks that was handwritten digit recognition more successfully than any other method. This figure here is maybe also of historical importance and comes from the authors. So as input we see an image here, and then how the authors depict a convolutional layer is probably by showing some sort of a filter kernel on the previous layer, and then this type of, I don't know what that is, an arrow, and then we have the output, which is the next layer shown here. So in some way, this is an attempt at a three-dimensional drawing where the size of these things probably depicts the resolution, and how many of these squares there are depicts the number of channels. After the first convolution, there should be 6 channels, so I guess this is more like an abstract depiction of the number of channels. And then later, there should be 16 channels. All right, so first we have a convolution here, then there's a pooling layer that performs this subsampling and makes the resolution smaller. Then another conv layer and another pooling layer, and then multiple fully connected layers. And then we have the final output. This network has a few things that deviate from how things are done today. However, this architecture principle to have convolutional layers, pooling layers, and then at the end a few fully connected layers is what heavily inspired AlexNet, the network that really convinced a lot of people to switch to deep learning in 2011. So here are some details. One interesting thing is that the second convolutional layer has filters that do not cover all channels to save memory and computation. So let's say the input has 6 channels to a particular layer. And then what could be done is that one convolutional filter does not take all 6 channels as input, but only a subset, let's say only 3. And so there could be then some form of a sparsity pattern that is handcrafted for each convolutional filter that determines which of the input channels are used and which are not used. Then this network has nonlinear activations after pooling layers. This is also no longer common. All right, let's just look at some things. We start by a grayscale image of size 32 times 32, and then we put it into a convolutional layer with 6 filters, and the kernel size of these convolutional layers is 5 by 5. Stride 1, padding 0, 10H activation function, and since there is no padding, the resolution decreases to 28 times 28, but now we have 6 channels. We have a pooling layer with 2 by 2 kernel size, stride 2, so we divide the resolution by 2, and there's average pooling used, and here we see there's an activation actually after the pooling layer. So now the output is 14 times 14 spatial resolution and 6 channels. Now this is the complicated convolutional layer that has the sparsity pattern. There will be 16 filters, and the spatial resolution in theory is 5 times 5 times 6, but this 6 is not entirely true because of the sparsity pattern. Stride 1, padding 0, 10H, so we get this output of 10 times 10 times 16 number of channels. Again, some pooling, and then we see this pattern of 3 fully connected layers. This is something we will see also in AlexNet. The output here of the softmax is 10 outputs, so this is used for digit recognition, digits from 0 to 9. AlexNet is described in the paper Image Classification with Deep Convolutional Neural Networks by Krzyzewski et al. And the significant impact of AlexNet was made clear when it won the ImageNet challenge. And this big defeat of all other methods convinced a lot of people to invest time and energy into deep learning. The ideas presented in the paper are mainly sensible engineering choices that show how to engineer a neural network that works really well. Some of the things that the authors used were: 1, a method to train on GPUs in parallel. This was a significant challenge of the time because GPUs did not have enough memory. In some sense, looking back, it is hard to appreciate the tremendous effort that the authors had to invest, because nowadays to replicate everything with Python and PyTorch, I mean, we already discussed it's one line of code, but even if you cannot use this one line of code, it would be only very few lines of code to implement this network with the modern infrastructure. And everything works on the GPU really well. But back then, this was a tremendous effort to get things to work on the GPU and to set up the whole infrastructure for deep learning. The paper was advocating for the use of ReLU as one of the key ingredients to make the training work better and to make the training faster. Also, the network advocated dropout as regularization technique to improve performance. Some other details about the network: the authors proposed some form of norm layers that are not common anymore and that we therefore will not discuss here. The authors used dropout with a pretty high rate of 0.5 in selected layers. The paper made use of heavy data augmentation. That was also a strategy used to make the paper successful. Batch size 128, and as optimizer, the paper proposed to use stochastic gradient descent with momentum and momentum parameter 0.9. The learning rate started by 0.01 and was reduced by 10 manually when the validation accuracy plateaued. This is a strategy that survived probably for a long time and is still something people use today. The authors used weight decay as regularizer with a parameter 5e minus 4, and one thing the authors also used back then was already ensembling. 7 CNNs in an ensemble helped to improve performance from 18.2 to 15.4. So this is the error rate then and not the accuracy. the paper also used somewhat of a complex parallelization that again was necessary at the time because of limited memory, but this is not common anymore. So here is the famous AlexNet figure, and we also showed the figure from the paper because it's a figure of historic importance. Also historically, we can see the trend of ambitious initial authors drawing three-dimensional figures to depict their networks. This ambition was quickly reduced to two-dimensional figures as people found these three-dimensional figures to be too hard to make, especially for complex network structures and complex network topology. There were simply too many things to draw. Finally, for some of the recent papers, we see a trend from 2D figures to no figures at all, to just having basically a list, more like a printout, line-by-line printout of the network architecture. One thing to note about this figure is that the figure is somewhat cut off, but what we see here is the input image to the left, and there are two branches of the network that operate somewhat in parallel, but that communicate at certain communication points. So on the top, we see the first branch, kind of along here, and on the bottom, we have the second branch. And then what we see here kind of is some communication point where information gets exchanged between the top and the bottom branch. Same thing here. So the three-dimensional boxes encode the tensor sizes that are used. So the spatial resolution, for example, here the input data has size 224 times 224, and we have 3 channels. So that's the input RGB image. And this spatial resolution of 224 times 224 also, for historical reasons, stuck around for quite a long time. Then what we have is the visualization of the kernel size of convolutional filters. So for the first layer, we see 11 by 11 kernels were used for convolution. So that means the filter size was 11 by 11 by 3. Then the next layer, or the tensor that is output here, has depth 48 or 48 channels, and the resolution is 55 times 55. That is the spatial resolution. Then we see convolutional filters with kernel size 5 by 5, and so on and so forth. At the end, and here we see the link to LeNet, we see again these fully connected layers that are used, and there will also be 3 fully connected layers, and then at the end we get 1000 classes. So these are 1000 class probabilities for ImageNet. At the bottom we see the output of PyTorch. One calls the print out of a loaded AlexNet. Let's look at that in Colab. From Torch Vision, import models, model equals models.alexnet, print model. All right? Okay. So what we see here is this thing here, which is this strange parallelization. So let's forget about that. What we can see here is there's a conv 2D filter, and we have the filter parameters. For example, the kernel size 11 times 11. Then we see the padding in width and height direction, and the stride. So The stride of 4 means that we subsample, or the image resolution will be decreased by 4 in each of the width and height dimension. The output number of channels is 64. Then we have a ReLU activation function, and afterwards a max pooling layer, max pool 2D. Again, we have a kernel size 3 that maybe is a bit unusual, and stride 2. All right, let's go further down. What we can see here is a dropout layer with the dropout probability of 0.5, and then a linear or fully connected layer, another dropout, another linear, and here another linear. So we can see 3 linear layers. All right, let's see what other models we have here. All right, DenseNet, multiple DenseNets, GoogLeNet. So quite a number of networks to choose from. Which one do we like? Let's do VGG 19 or maybe VGG 16, something that is used in the style transfer project. All right, just see what happens. All right, so I highly recommend to look at several of these networks. This is a great way to study network architectures a bit, loading it here and printing it out. All right, so for example, what we see in this VGG architecture that we will discuss next is that this last structure somewhat survived. Again, we see linear layers here, linear layer here, linear layer here. So we have these 3 linear layers, and we also have this dropout with probability 0.5 and another dropout with probability 0.5. Let's look at some details, first as a review, and second to highlight some attributes of an architecture such as this one. So the first convolutional layer takes the input image, and it has 3 channels, and then the width height is 227. So there are some minor details of if the input is actually 224 or 227, which we'll not discuss here. The layer has 64 filters. This kernel size is 11 by 11, stride 4, and padding is 2. So as output, we obtain 64 channels because we have 64 filters, and then we have image or tensor of the spatial resolution 56 times 56. So how do we get this memory? Just what is the data structure size of the output of the first layer? We have to multiply 64 times 56 times 56. This is the tensor size. Then we need to multiply by 4 to have 4 bytes per number, and then we divide by 1024. How can we compute the number of parameters as 23,000? Well, we have filters of size 11 times 11 and number of channels 3. So far we have 11 times 11 times 3, and we have 64 of those, so we need to also multiply by 64. In addition, we have 64 bias terms, but that doesn't make a big difference in the final output, so the number is about 23,000 parameters that can be trained in the first layer. How can we compute the number of operations? The idea is that as one operation, we count a multiply and an add. And we'll also do it approximately, so we don't think about the architecture and the exact details too much. So what we're going to do is we're going to compute again how many output values do we have. Okay, we have 64 times 56 times 56 output values. And how many computations do we have to do per output value? Well, we'll just count the number of elements in the filter. So what we're going to do is we're going to count the filter as 11 times 11 times 3. And then we can ignore the bias and what exactly is this multiply add, and we get a pretty good estimate of 73 million operations. By contrast, let's try out a pooling layer, and in a pooling layer we still have a significant amount of memory, so the memory is reduced because the pooling layer reduces the spatial resolution. But we have 0 trainable parameters, so the pooling layer just is a hard-coded computation, nothing to be trained, and the number of megaflops is pretty small, 0.4 approximately. In fact, this number is so small that it is approximated by 0 in other layers. This doesn't mean that there's no computation going on, that just means it's rounded down to 0. So again, we see this kind of idea to have pooling layers with a kernel size of 3 and a stride of 2. This was an idea maybe advocated back then, not an idea that survived the test of time. Now, for the design of the channels, what we can see is that we kind of start by 3 channels in the input, and then we have going upward here, so 64, 64, 192, 192, 384, 256, 256, 256. So what we see is that the number of channels increases, and then at the end it decreases a bit. But this type of concept is still there. So when you look at these type of convolutional networks, or almost any convolutional network, what it would do is that the number of channels would increase and the spatial resolution would decrease. So we see this inverse trend here, 56, 27, 27, 13, 13, 13, 13, 6. Also, one trend that we can see here that still persists up until now is that these convolutional neural networks do most of their work on very small resolutions. So if you think today about an image, you're thinking about megapixel images. You're thinking 4 million pixels per image. However, if we look at convolutional neural networks, what you see is that they do computations on super tiny images by contrast. They do images by 13 by 13. So this is a huge gap between where these convolutional neural networks are and how large the resolution of a lot of the images is that are used in photography today, even in mobile devices. Let's look at the trend in memory, and the trend in memory is that we start using quite a lot of memory in the beginning, but as we go down the network, we see that the memory consumption gets reduced drastically. So almost all the memory gets used in the first layers. The trainable parameters paint a completely different picture. We start with very small number of parameters, but then as we go down, there's a reasonable number of parameters, but then way at the end, these fully connected layers, these linear layers, they completely dominate the number of trainable parameters. There's almost the overwhelming majority of the trainable parameters in the network are in the fully connected layers. So this is probably a bit of the legacy of LeNet, where this idea is kept to have these three fully connected layers. The intuition somewhat, I would say, is that convolutions are a local operation. The convolutions only see the neighborhood around the pixel, and with convolution filters of size 3 and 5, they only see a very small neighborhood around the pixel. So it does make sense to think that these fully convolutional layers, these linear layers in the end, kind of help for the global analysis of the image. So we have the local analysis with the convolutional layers, and then at the end we have this extensive global analysis. Again, maybe the idea is that having one linear layer basically is just one linear layer, doesn't sound complicated enough, so you want to have three so that complex global functions can be modeled. We will still see that in the next network, but this idea also did not survive the test of time. This is really a massive amount of trainable parameters invested, and as it turns out, it doesn't help a lot. For the flops, the computation, we see that most of the work is done somewhere here in the convolutional layers. So if we think about the contrast of convolutional layers and linear layers, then we could say that the linear, the fully connected layers, they dominate the number of trainable parameters, but the convolutional layers, they dominate the memory consumption and they dominate the actual computation. This makes sense to say now and to go back to the lecture about convolutions, where we said that the weight sharing is an important aspect of convolution because the weight sharing drastically reduces the number of trainable parameters. This is what we can observe here. Again, this trend visualized in a different way. So here's the memory consumption, and we can see that the memory consumption is dominated by convolution, but the fully connected layers in the end don't make a big difference, but the trainable parameters are completely dominated by the last three fully connected layers. And then the number of flops is a bit more balanced, but still overwhelmingly, I would say, dominated by the convolutional layers. So AlexNet won the 2012 ImageNet Challenge, and this was its big success. It started in 2011, but in 2012, with the ImageNet Challenge 1, that was really when this massive impact started to happen. The ImageNet Challenge was at that point in time probably something like the holy grail of computer vision. That was the most important competition that could have been won. Next year, we see an engineered network that kind of improves upon AlexNet. The success is still quite significant. So you see the top 5 error is being reduced from 16.4 to 11.7%. There's a paper describing this network. It's at FNet. I would guess that has to do with the author names being Zeiler and Fergus. And the paper itself is a bit more about visualization strategies for convolutional neural networks. However, still, there's some importance in the network as having won the ImageNet Challenge. And so here's some engineering ideas. One is change from 11 times 11 filter. This is the original filters. They had 11 times 11 stride 4 to a filter that had 7 times 7 stride 2. Now this is a significant change because the stride 2 instead of stride 4 makes the resolution a lot higher. So we have a resolution of 110 instead of, I think, 56 was it for AlexNet after the first convolution. Also, the authors proposed to increase the number of filters, that means the number of channels for conv and fully connected layers by a factor of 2. So this is an idea that started very early on, and this is the idea we will almost kind of conclude with, that it is possible to scale up convolutional neural networks. And scaling up can be done along 3 axes. One, we can increase the resolution, which has been done here by having a smaller stride in the first filter. One can increase the width, make the network wider, which is done by increasing the number of channels. And then also one can make the network deeper by adding more layers. This is something that I think hasn't been done here in ZFNet. But in general, scaling up a network can lead to better performance, and this is also something here that was observed. So why didn't they really make it deeper? One problem is that at this point in time, batch normalization hasn't been invented yet. And it is difficult to make a network very deep without batch normalization. Of course, we might expect that other inventions will allow us to make networks deeper, maybe in the future, but for now, it seems the dominant factor for deeper networks is batch normalization. Now, next year, 2014, there were 2 engineering feats that are very important. One was kind of a mini team from a research group, and another one was a large engineering team from a company. So the VGG network was proposed by Simonian and Sisserman. The paper is called Very Deep Convolutional Networks for Large-Scale Image Recognition. Now, this very deep didn't last long, so basically next year these networks already looked quite shallow in comparison, but basically this is really the engineering challenge here was going from something like 7-8 layers to higher, and they managed to go up to 19 layers. So design principles used were they only used 3x3 convolutional layers. And one could argue that something with, if we want to have filters with larger footprint, we could always use more filters with a smaller footprint. So, for example, a combination of 2 3x3 convolutional layers would have the same footprint in the original image as 1 5x5 convolutional layer. All max pools are 2 times 2 stride 2. This is the more straightforward choice. And after pooling, we double the number of channels. So this can be argued by looking at the information in some sense. So what happens is that if we just downsample and we divide the width and the height by 2, we actually lose 75% of the information. In some sense, increasing the number of channels compensates for this loss of information. And the other thing is that having smaller resolution and more channels, this keeps the computational load more constant throughout the network. Still, this idea of downsampling and increasing the number of channels is also something that other authors looked at later on and thought this wasn't really the proper way to do it because there's too much information destroyed that cannot then be recovered later on. Let's look at this network architecture. The input is shown in purple, which is the image of the standard resolution with 3 channels. One conf layer plus ReLU is shown in blue. So what we see here are 2 conf layers with 2 ReLU activation functions. Pooling is shown in orange, and fully connected layers are shown in green. So here we can see some network details. Similar to other authors later on, this paper introduces multiple configurations of the same network. So there's a configuration A, LRN, B, C, D, and E. E is the largest, and these networks are known as VGG dash and then a number, so VGG 19 is the name of this last network. Let's just look at the last one. So we have the input image that comes in here, and then the input image is processed by 2 convolutional layers, and the kernel size is always 3, so we don't need to mention it anymore, and we have 64 channels as output. Then there's a max pool that's the same across the board, and then we have 2 conf layers, this time with 128 channels. Another max pool, and then in this block we have 4 conf layers, this time with 256 channels. We see this design principle. After every max pool, the number of channels doubles. So after this max pool, again we see doubling of 256 to 512 channels. The last block has also several conf layers, so 4 again. So this figure is slightly cut off. There's another max pool and 3 linear / fully connected layers and a softmax layer. What we can see here is that these are really big networks in terms of number of trainable parameters. They have over 100 million trainable parameters. So the last configuration, 144 million. We have somewhat of a split in architecture design, and this will also be clear when we look at the next network. That is, one branch kind of started off saying that, okay, these networks need to be efficient. So we actually would like to have networks that have a small number of trainable parameters. So a lot of the networks we will discuss, actually they will not start to go a lot higher than 100 million, but a lot of them will actually have less than 100 million parameters. Another branch says more like, okay, we want to have the absolute best performance possible. Let's build just the largest network we can build, as long as it still gives us improved performance. And these networks then go up to 1 billion parameters. One problem is that if you would like to use a network in your research, these networks with a billion parameters are impractical. You don't really have the hardware to deal with them. You don't have the hardware to train them. Also, a lot of times these networks are building blocks. There will be other building blocks of other networks taking also a lot of parameters used and combined to build a larger network. So if one of the components already has 500 million parameters, there's nothing really you can do to add other components. So the efficiency is really an important and guiding principle for network design. Some more details. So for preprocessing, they subtract the mean RGB value from each pixel as a preprocess. They use mini-batch gradient descent with momentum as optimization algorithm as before. Batch size is 256. Regularization, weight, decay, and dropout. So we see that a lot of these ideas have been kept. The learning rate schedule initially set to 10 to the power of minus 2 and decreased by a factor of 10 when the validation set accuracy stopped improving. And the learning rate was decreased 3 times. So that seems to be more or less the same thing that was used before, maybe just written in a slightly different way. Then training for 370k iteration or 74 epochs. For testing, they converted the fully connected layers to convolutional layers to test on larger images. This is a conversion that we discussed before, that one can basically convert the fully connected layers, linear layers in the end, to convolutional layers. And what that does is it, in fact, in parallel, computes the output of the network similar to as some form of sliding window going over the input and then averaging the results. So this is a form to use, this is a form to convert the network to a network that is more independent of the input resolution and that can take input images of a larger resolution. This network is very popular as a pre-trained encoder, so we could say this network is a network that basically can be used as feature extractor. So we cut off this last part, and then what we have is a method that takes an input image and converts it to a feature tensor. This feature tensor can then be used for maybe nearest neighbor search to find similar images, or for other types of computations that need a feature description of an image. As we discussed in transfer learning, one could also build other classifiers on top of such a feature description. As we will do in project 2, these feature extractions are popular for texture synthesis, style transfer, computing perceptual similarities between images. Also, as discussed, the fully connected layers at the end are probably overkill. They use lots of parameters, but they provide little improvement. So there was this one paper that described this idea called network in network, and it described something that just turns out to be equivalent to a one-by-one convolutional filter. So the idea was to say that, okay, we have a layer, maybe a convolutional layer, and what we could do is, let's say this convolutional layer compute some output per pixel of a high-dimensional tensor, and then what we could do is we could attach a fully connected network to each pixel of a high-dimensional tensor, and then this fully connected network would operate pixel-wise and share its weights. but this design is actually equivalent to the one-by-one convolutions that we already discussed in the context of convolutional networks. So while there was maybe a particular design that the authors proposed here, the most important thing is more that the 1x1 convolutions started to become popular around this time, and this paper probably helped to popularize them. So let's look at this inception network, which was the competition to the VGG network. It did better and it has better performance, but probably it was also created with a lot more effort. They did go a different route. VGG went the route of creating a massive network, basically the biggest network they could build, probably. Inception 1.0, they went the route of trying to design a network that is really efficient. One idea the authors propose is to build a good building block module and then stack the module. This is a design principle that also survived up until today in neural network architecture design. Let's look at two such modules that were proposed. The first module is shown to the left, and what we can see here now is the idea of branching, copying, and of concatenation. So we have some previous layer that gives us a tensor as output. What we're doing is we copy this tensor and send it on its way along 4 edges. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of these next building blocks will receive the same tensor as input. Now, you might say that you don't really know which convolutional filter size is best, so why not just try all of them and then combine the result? So we have some filters that have kernel size 1 by 1, some filters have kernel size 3 by 3, and some filters have kernel size 5 by 5. And then maybe max pooling also helps, so let's also add a max pooling. But this max pooling is done without stride, so it does not change the resolution. At the end, we obtain multiple tensors that all have the same spatial resolution, and therefore we can concatenate them together here. This inception module with dimension reductions can help to reduce computations and can also, in some sense, help to reduce memory. So again, we have this previous layer, but what if before we actually perform these 3 by 3 convolutions, we first reduce the number of channels with a 1 by 1 convolution? So in this branch, we first go through a 1 by 1 convolution to reduce the number of channels and then go into the 3 by 3 convolution. Same thing here, the tensor goes through a different 1 by 1 convolution and then goes into this 5 by 5 convolution. Some detail here is that this 1 by 1 convolution in this branch is performed after the pooling and not before. One particular architecture that uses what the author called inception module, introduced on the previous slide, is called GoogleNet. The idea of this interesting naming scheme is to acknowledge the company Google that developed this architecture and call it GoogleNet, but also pay homage to this important network LeNet from Jan LeCun and capitalize in such a way that this LeNet part is emphasized. I somehow have this feeling that VGG ended up being more popular simply because of this confusing naming scheme. So should you pronounce that GoogLeNet or GoogleNet, or is this called Inception Network, or what is this Inception and GoogleNet? So at the end, I think a good name is really important to popularize your research. While this name is extremely cleverly designed, of course, maybe it is a bit too clever. So what we see is a combination of inception blocks with pooling layers, and we also have the idea of auxiliary classifiers to help the training. As we discussed, batch normalization has not been invented yet. Going to this high number of layers is a major engineering effort that needs quite some hacking to make it work. So VGG also cannot be trained out of the box. There's some complicated training scheme, I think, where you start with a network that you train and then insert layers. And what we see here is the idea of auxiliary classifiers. That means that there is an auxiliary classifier added to earlier layers of the network, and this should make sure that tensors coming out from these earlier layers are already useful to classify an image correctly. In the end, these auxiliary classifiers are not used, only this final classifier here is used. However, these branches with auxiliary classifiers are there to stabilize training. So not only these inception modules are used in this network design. We also have the idea of a starting component, maybe a stem, that is used to fairly aggressively downsample the network. And again, we see that most of these computations are actually performed on tensor resolutions of fairly small size.